It's early in the morning on the 3rd of December 1854 and, for once, we're not in Ballarat. But there I go, breaking the fourth wall. Sorry, let's get back into our immersion, shall we? Out on the road, such as it is, it's more of a broken down, wagon wheel rutted track than anything else to the goldfields near Warrenheip, which is around 6.5 kilometres from Ballarat, is a large party of Americans. 200 strong, in fact, being led by the dashing James McGill. The charismatic 21-year-old, said to be a graduate of the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point, is with the enigmatic but probably more experienced Captain Nelson, another slightly older American, and they've positioned their forces above a point where the road curves tightly. Some are mounted, others on foot, and they're all waiting in the pre-dawn blackness for the first sound of the quarry they've been expecting for the last 2 days. 800 soldiers, bringing artillery, are going to come up this road sooner or later, and the 2 Americans, along with their men, are dedicated stockaders. McGill is, in fact, Peter Lawler's second-in-command and has been ordered by the commander himself to set this ambush up. The plan is to surprise the redcoats, cause confusion in the ranks, kill a few of them, capture some of their baggage carts, preferably the ones carrying muskets and bayonets, and slow their advance to Ballarat. Ambitiously, McGill also wants to capture the artillery if he can and bring it back to the stockade. Now that would teach the government a thing or two. But for now, McGill just has to fantasise about arming the stockade with heavy guns because the soldiers haven't come yet. But that's all right. He's determined and he'll keep waiting every night if he has to until the soldiers come up the road from Melbourne and into his trap. But they never do. Instead, as the dawn breaks and the Americans are preparing to head back to the stockade, they meet a trickle and then a flood of people running in the opposite direction. A flood of wounded, terrified people. The stockade has fallen, the stockaders have been arrested, and Peter Lawler, who McGill knows well and likes immensely, at least for now, was gravely wounded, and some are even saying he's been killed. But how on earth did this happen? Government camp hadn't been reinforced yet, and there's no way those 800 soldiers could have got past McGill's men undetected. He's completely at a loss to understand how the 300-odd men at government camp could have possibly mounted a successful attack on the well-defended stockade, manned by so many armed and determined men. But he's also not going to hang around to find out. If the stockaders are being rounded up, and they most certainly are, then McGill, as the second-in-command, is probably on the wanted list. He lays low with a friend for the day before escaping to Melbourne and hiding out at the Port Nepean quarantine station until a general amnesty is announced some months later. McGill has nothing to fear by coming out of hiding. After all, despite the wild rumours to the contrary, it was pure coincidence that he and his fellow Americans had been absent from the stockade on the morning of the attack. Or was it? I'm Juliana, and you're listening to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. Welcome back, my fellow skeptics, and thank you so much for joining me yet again on the goldfields of 1854 Ballarat. I would like to begin by acknowledging the sovereignty of the Wurundjeri Wathaurong people of the land I am podcasting on today, and would like to offer my respects to their elders past and present. Now, if you listened to that immersion and thought the name James McGill sounded familiar, then you were right. We talked about McGill when we discussed Peter Lawler's open letter of 1855. Lawler absolutely slandered McGill, claiming the young American had been in charge of the stockade on the night of the attack and that he'd left without authorization, when in fact Lawler had told McGill to take his men and set up an ambush for the soldiers coming up the road from Melbourne. However, the suggestion that McGill had been a shirker dogged him to his grave, despite multiple attempts over his life to clear his name. He was hampered in this effort not only by Peter Lalor, a man who McGill had once counted as a dear friend, but also by anti-American sentiment common in Victoria at the time, which made people more willing to believe those such as Lalor than to believe McGill himself. An unsubstantiated but powerful myth, which continues to be repeated to this day in fact, is that McGill and the other Americans left the stockade en masse at the urging of their ambassador. As we'll hear in the course of this podcast, this is demonstrably untrue, but the popular myth of Eureka that was being developed even before the ruins of the stockade had stopped smoking had no time for American participation in this Australian story. But before we get into that, and the significant role played by the Americans at Eureka, let's have a closer look at who James McGill was. Actually, let's look at who McGill said he was, and then find out whether or not he was telling the truth. We're far enough into the Eureka story by now that I'm sure it won't surprise you to hear that McGill's nose, like those of many participants on both sides, could get very long at times. So McGill was born in Boston, Massachusetts, around 1833 and claimed he was both a West Point graduate and a veteran of the Mexican-American War. His birthplace and date are confirmed. He arrived in Victoria from the Californian goldfields in 1853, and there was a rumour that he stepped off the boat with $30,000 in his pocket. If this was true, then he must have done exceptionally well in California. And he did have some early success in Ballarat, which lends weight to the idea that he did have experience in mining. Now, he never made anything like $30,000 American dollars mining in Australia, but he did well for himself and probably would have been able to retire comfortably with his wife and children later in life had he not spent so much money trying to clear his name after Eureka before sadly descending into alcoholism. However, before Eureka turned his life upside down, he was a regular face at events for American expats, usually hosted by theatre owner and entertainer Sarah Hammer, who was herself an American. He was also important enough to be invited to attend a formal dinner in honour of the American ambassador James Tarleton when Tarleton visited Ballarat in 1854, but McGill threw his lot in with Lalor and the stockaders shortly after. He gave the impression of having vast military knowledge and experience and was a very confident young man, as evidenced by the way he entered the stockade. According to stockader Raffaello Carboni, who later wrote a very colourful book about his experience at Eureka, McGill rode up to the recently constructed barrier on the 2nd of December 1854, a party of 200 armed Americans marching behind him, and upon seeing the astonished Peter Lalor, reportedly asked him, "What's up?" Lalor, as you can imagine, was only too happy to have McGill and his men, although what military experience McGill actually had is debatable. Let's start with the claim he had attended West Point. This was widely believed by McGill's contemporaries, although no James McGill appears on the list of West Point graduates at any time McGill could have been studying there. Close examination of the records by historians has also revealed that there is no evidence McGill himself ever said he'd attended West Point, but the fact it was believed by so many stockaders, Carboni and Lalor among them, indicates that someone had certainly said something to that effect. It could have been like a giant game of telephone or Chinese whispers, with the story starting that McGill had been in the American Army, which we'll come to in a moment, and getting wilder and wilder with each retelling. But if exaggerated stories about McGill's past were flying around the stockade, it seems he made no attempt to correct them, and this may have affected his later ability to correct the myths being spread about his conduct at the stockade as well. Two secondary sources, written after McGill's death in 1883, declared he had studied at West Point, but he'd used a false name and date of birth, as he'd been too young to attend. Tellingly, however, both authors who claimed they'd interviewed McGill in the last years of his life gave different names and dates of birth he supposedly studied under, and McGill's widow was adamant that her husband had never given interviews to anyone. These facts, along with McGill's youth, had he attended West Point and graduated in time to serve in the Mexican-American War, he would have had to have been admitted there when he was 10, which is quite unbelievable even for the 19th century, strongly suggest he never studied there. But whether he started the rumour or someone else did is unknown. And if he heard it, he seems to have gone along with it and basked in a little reflected glory, which came from being assumed to be an experienced officer from a prestigious military college. This fits with what we know of McGill's personality. He was confident to the point of cockiness, with a streak of recklessness and a sense of invincibility that I'm sure many listeners who were once young will recognise today. But what about the claim he served in the US Army during the Mexican-American War? This was a claim McGill did make, or at least partially. He said he'd been in the US Army, and James McGill served with the 15th Regiment during the Mexican-American War. It has generally been assumed this was the James McGill of Eureka. However, a more rigorous historical study has questioned this assumption. As mentioned above, McGill was very young during the Mexican-American War, and at the time the 15th Regiment was engaged in combat, he would have been 13 at the oldest. This doesn't make his participation in the regiment impossible, but it would have been unusual. While the American Army did, like all contemporary forces of its time, recruit boy soldiers, they did not regularly make their way into frontline units except as drummers, and McGill never claimed he had been a drummer. Generally, boys were employed in combat support roles, which of course could still be very dangerous. And the James McGill of the 15th was promoted to second lieutenant in 1848. The McGill at Eureka would have been 15 at this time, and while it's not impossible they are one in the same, there's no evidence that the 15th was ever so badly mauled in an encounter with the Mexican Army that it needed to promote teens to officer rank. All in all, it is highly unlikely that Second Lieutenant James McGill of the 15th Regiment US Army was the same man who rode into the Eureka stockade 6 years later. James was the third most common name given to baby boys in the United States between 1800 and 1850, and there were plenty of McGills as well. By 1840, there were McGills in every state and in the North American territories, which would later become part of the United States. There would have been hundreds of James McGills running around the US in the years the Eureka McGill was there, but he may not have been lying entirely about having some military experience, or even technically lying about serving in the Mexican-American War. Gregory Blake has uncovered evidence of a James McGill who was the right age, serving in a United States militia in California, which was then a Mexican possession, at the time of the war. What is very significant about this militia is that many of its members were young, and the intention was that they would remain in California as settlers after the US won. The assumption of the man who raised the militia was, of course, that his side would win. He turned out to be right, but it's still a rather bold assumption to make. Could this then be the James McGill of Eureka? He came from the right place and was the right age, and if he was in California at the beginnings of the gold rush there, around 1848, it would have been more likely that he would have been more successful than those who came later, which could account for the amount of money he supposedly had when he landed in Victoria. This particular claim is impossible to prove or disprove. The only question raised is that the James McGill of the militia was badly burned on his face and hands in a guardhouse explosion of 1847. Now, we have several contemporary descriptions of the McGill from Eureka, and none of them mention any signs of burn scars or other injuries of this nature. If the two McGills were one and the same, this could have indicated that his injuries had faded somewhat by 1854, or it could have been that the chroniclers of Eureka, in the fashion of their day, simply didn't want to mention the presence of any scars. Social norms and customs dictated that things such as obvious physical injuries weren't openly discussed, let alone recorded for posterity. It's also possible that McGill still did have serious scars from the accident, but that he'd become adept at hiding them. Even today, we know that burns victims who have visible scars can feel shame around them. And it's possible that McGill, who was living in an era where any kind of long-term physical injury or disability was seen as a sign that something was morally wrong with you, may have felt the same. He could have come up with clever ways to conceal the evidence or extent of his injuries, if he had them, so that they were not noticed by those around him. Further weight is given to the suggestion that McGill may have been a young man in a militia by the evidence of those around him. It was noted that while McGill arranged the sentries around the stockade well and had some basic knowledge of drill, there was nothing that extended much beyond, as one stockader put it, an elementary course of a few hours. As Blake points out, if McGill had been a young man in a militia, and in a militia which was mainly concerned with garrison and policing duties, as the militia in California during the Mexican-American War was, then this would actually be the expected extent of his military knowledge: basic elementary drill courses and setting up sentry posts. McGill's confidence then allowed him to project the idea that he was more experienced than he was, although, to give him his due, McGill never really got a chance to prove what he was made of. He was absent from the stockade on the night of the attack and never ambushed the soldiers coming up from Melbourne either. For all we know, he may have been a very capable combatant, but it's one we'll just have to wonder about. However, based on what we know of his skills and experience, it's unlikely he was anything more than average, although, like most Americans of his time, he undoubtedly knew his way around a revolver. Now, I'm going to pause here for another break, and when I get back, we're going to examine what it was that caused the American contribution at the stockade to be overlooked. Stick around, skeptics. And welcome back. This is The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis, and we're having a look at the American contribution to the Eureka stockade. If you're not familiar with the American side of the Eureka story, don't worry, not a lot of people are. This is because the myth-making around Eureka pushed the Americans into the background when creating this Australian story. And anti-American sentiment was still running high into this country well into the 20th century. The average British colonist in 1854 thought the Americans were an innately lawless, violent people who would poison good, moral, progressive British society with their backwards ideas. The American Revolution had faded from living memory by 1854, although the children and grandchildren of those on both sides would have still been talking about it. They're still talking about it today, after all. But the War of 1812, which had been fought between Britain and America, was still fresh in the minds of both the British and the Americans, and both sides were still claiming they were the ultimate victors. This is another argument which continues to this day, and I don't think we'll ever hear the end of that one either. The War of 1812 ended with a negotiated peace, so I'm not really sure either the British or the Americans can claim they were victors. But moving on. The really big issue between Britain and America in 1854, and let's be honest, between the various states of America itself, was slavery. Now, despite what Britain claimed, it did not have a stellar record when it came to slavery. And while the British had been swanning around, patting themselves on the back for abolishing the slave trade in 1807, and then slavery itself in 1838, except in territories controlled by the East India Company, they were also much more interested in protecting their economies and maintaining their standard of living than they were in actually doing anything to allow formerly enslaved people across the British Empire to live safe and happy lives. Slavery in the British Empire was well within living memory at this time, but the majority of colonists in Victoria really had no idea what it had meant or the way their government had behaved in its aftermath to avoid taking any responsibility. best that could be said for them, and this is not an excuse, by the way, ignorance is not an excuse, but the best that could be said was that most ordinary Britons understood that slavery had been wrong. And by this point, they were just happy that their country didn't participate in it anymore. Of course, Britain was actually neck deep in slavery in 1854 and would be until partway through the American Civil War, when a Union blockade prevented trade with the Confederacy. And prior to this, Britain had been one of the largest buyers of raw goods produced by slaves on plantations in the American Deep South, because the use of unpaid, unfree labour meant the materials could be bought cheaply. This was not a fact that was advertised to the ordinary Briton at the time, however. So most of the colonists in Victoria saw themselves as being part of a nation which had risen above such cruelty, and they looked down on the Americans for not only participating in slavery, but defending it as well. However, this wasn't the only issue that caused the British to treat Americans with something bordering on wary disdain. Despite the democratic overtones which had swept Europe during the failed revolutions of 1848, and which would colour later retellings of the Eureka stockade, the vast majority of people in majorly white British colonies could not imagine government without a monarchy. And yes, my friends, that includes the Irish. Republicanism did not become a mainstream position in Ireland until after the Easter Rising of 1916. It was very much a fringe idea until this point. Now, as we all know, America hadn't had a monarchy since the end of the Revolution, and their head of state was, and still is, elected. The issue at hand here was not the limited democracy in America. It was actually broader at the time than what was offered in Britain or the colonies, but it certainly wasn't universal. But the perceived strangeness of electing the head of state. This idea was almost subversive to the ordinary Briton or colonist, especially at a time when the young Queen Victoria was popular and seen as a beacon of change and modernity. The monarchy was something sacred, and most people just couldn't imagine government without it. They were not about absolute monarchy, but constitutional monarchy was a beloved form of government at the time, and anything else was viewed as not only odd, but completely unnatural. Now, it's easy for us, sitting in 2024, to laugh at the idea that monarchy was some kind of natural state. All governments are, after all, man-made. But the people of 1854 were no more or less stupid than we are today. Like us, they wanted a system they were comfortable with and which they understood. Most of the people who came to Australia were seeking to loosen some of the restrictions on them in Britain, but they didn't want to overthrow the whole system. The assumption about Americans was that they were always looking to have a revolution, and so were inherently dangerous to the natural order of things. A sense of British exceptionalism played into this idea as well. If, as the thinking of most ordinary British and British colonists went, Britain was the most powerful, progressive, forward-thinking nation that had ever existed, then the British way of doing things must be the right way. It might not be the only way, but anyone who was doing it differently was clearly doing it wrong. There was also a perception of Americans as a very violent people who enjoyed lynching anyone they could get their hands on and stabbing people with Bowie knives right after blowing their heads off with Colt revolvers. In fact, the British perception of the United States could be best described as one giant camp horror movie with body parts flying in all directions. Now, this, of course, was an exaggeration, and once on the goldfields or in the cities, the Americans proved no more or less violent than any other group of people. Like most immigrants, they gravitated towards their own people, and there were areas of Ballarat and other diggings which were predominantly American, just as there were places which were mostly Irish, English, Chinese, or Canadian, for example. Those Americans who had arrived from the Californian goldfields did tend to be very successful because they already knew what to look for, although knowledge could only take a man so far in this era of gold mining before the advent of proper mining schools and the birth of the professional miner. A large amount of luck was involved, and The Americans as a whole were no better at mining than any other group. But when they did strike it lucky, other miners were quick to be resentful and declare that the Americans were having it better than they were. So this was the world the Americans in Ballarat, and there were hundreds of them on the goldfields, occupied. Among their fellows and those they lived alongside, they were seen as ordinary diggers. But for those brought up on exaggerated stories of their predisposition for violence, they were to be treated with caution and possibly avoided. For their part, the Americans did not generally involve themselves deeply in what they saw as British issues, and it should be noted that few of them were intending to stay in Australia. Like most miners, they wanted to get rich and go home. Yet, as the situation on the goldfields began to deteriorate, especially after the monster meeting at which licences were burned, followed by Robert Reed's stupid decision to conduct a massive licence hunt the next day, the Americans started to take a lively interest in what their fellow diggers were up to. Charles Ferguson, a Californian native who was not only involved in Eureka but also survived the idiocy of the Burke and Wills expedition and later published memoirs about his experiences in Australia, noted there was a significant interest among his fellows, including James McGill, who Ferguson had a passing acquaintance with, in joining the Digger Army, as it was being called. There was a meeting of the American diggers on the afternoon of the 28th of November after Reed's licence hunt drama, which was partly held to discuss whether the Americans should remain neutral in what was happening on the diggings, and partly to prepare a welcome for the American ambassador James Tarleton, who was coming up to the diggings from Melbourne. Ferguson was of the opinion that the Americans should stay well out of whatever was happening on the diggings, unless the diggers involved asked them to join in, where McGill thought they should be offering their services immediately, and indeed some already had. Ferguson claimed to have made a speech which was greeted with applause from his countrymen that no American should involve himself in British politics, but that if the diggers were to take a stand, the Americans would stand with them. This might be true, but by the time Ferguson published his memoirs, he was, almost literally, the last man standing from both Eureka and the Burke and Wills expedition, and certainly the only American left to be able to tell his countrymen's side of the story. With no one to contradict him, his words must be treated with caution, although the sentiment was probably true. I'm going to pause here for another break, and when I get back, we're going to look closer at what happened to change the minds of many of these Americans and cause them to throw their lot in with the stockaders. Don't go anywhere. We're back, and this is The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. Now, it would have been very easy for the Americans in Ballarat, most of whom seemed to share Ferguson's sentiment that it was better not to get involved, to do just that. On the 28th of November 1854, shortly after their meeting at the Adelphi Theatre, which was owned and run by fellow American expat Sarah Hammer, several of them, including McGill and Ferguson, were invited to government camp to a dinner to honour the American ambassador's visit to Ballarat. The dinner went smoothly, and the Americans listened attentively, or at the very least pretended to listen attentively, to Tarleton's reminders that they must follow the laws of the country in which they were residing. They assured him that they would not get up to any trouble, and McGill responded to a toast made by Tarleton to the United States Army. Around this time, shots were heard from the diggings, and Commissioner Reed very abruptly left, along with several other important administrators, although the Americans would not learn until the next day that the 12th Regiment had been attacked on the Eureka lead, requiring the 40th to go down to the diggings and rescue them. For McGill, this seems to have been the moment where he decided he wanted in on the action. The brash, confident 21-year-old spent the next 2 days gathering 200 like-minded men before riding up to the then newly built stockade and offering his services. Precisely why he got involved is anyone's guess. But I suspect that as someone with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, he felt he deserved to be in the thick of things. Ferguson too decided to throw his lot in with the stockaders around this time and joined the second of the two large American divisions, which formed over the 24 hours or so before the battle took place. McGill's was the Independent California Revolver Brigade, while Ferguson joined the Independent California Rangers. Of course, the names were more than anything just part of the game of soldiers the stockaders were playing, but it must be said that these American divisions were probably the most capable soldiers outside the professional army in Ballarat, and they knew their way around both small and long arms. Many of them were veterans of the Mexican-American War, that is, people who had actually seen and been in the thick of the fighting, unlike McGill, who would have watched from the sidelines if he'd been involved at all. According to the records we have, there were anywhere between 200 to 400 Americans involved in the Eureka stockade at its height, and there were 120 men present when the attack took place on early Sunday morning. McGill had taken 200 men, mostly but not entirely Americans, to ambush the soldiers coming up from Melbourne Road, and most of the other stockaders had left for the night, as we've discussed in previous episodes. However, among those 120 were a significant number of Americans, and when the attack began at around 4 a.m., it was led by a group of the so-called California Rangers, who were also responsible for most of the dead and wounded soldiers at Eureka. Private Michael Ronnie, the first man killed at the stockade, was almost certainly shot by an American rifleman, and the California Rangers lost 40 or so men in a reckless charge at the military as they breached the stockade. 6 of the Eureka 7 all died from gunshot wounds at very close range, which suggests they were hit by revolver fire rather than rifles or muskets, and the largest group in the stockade armed with revolvers were the Americans. Significantly too, many of the Americans killed at Eureka died from bayonet injuries rather than gunshot wounds, indicating they were fighting hand-to-hand, or at the very least at a very close range, when they died. Now, this is quite important because the range of a revolver, or the accurate range of a revolver, I should say, at this time was about the range of a bayonet, to be honest. Guns were not accurate in 1854, and revolvers were notorious for hitting everything except what the shooter wanted to hit, unless one was at near point-blank range. However, shooting a soldier armed with a bayonet at close range also put the shooter within reach of that bayonet, and bayonets were probably the most feared weapons until near the end of the 19th century. Muskets themselves were only slightly more accurate than revolvers, but the way war was fought at the time meant this inaccuracy was not a serious problem. A massed group of soldiers armed with muskets, which had roughly 40% accuracy in perfect conditions, firing at another massed group, were going to hit something and inflict some serious damage no matter what something they hit. Soldiers were also trained at this time, despite odd internet rumours to the contrary, to aim when they fired their muskets, and they were familiar with the idiosyncrasies of their guns. However, it was when using a bayonet in a close-range fight that the professional soldier of 1854 really came into his own. At the Eureka stockade, once the soldiers had breached the barricade and the Americans who rushed forward to try and repel them had taken their shots, they were in trouble. They didn't have any weapon that could match the soldiers' bayonets, and the fact that they had fired on the soldiers meant that, despite claims to the contrary that McGill and several other Americans made later in their lives, the soldiers were legally entitled to engage with them. The Americans were not unarmed, as later myth would suggest. They were heavily armed, but they had the wrong weapons for the fight in which they found themselves in. In fact, this was true in general for the fight of the stockade as a whole, I think. The advantages were with the stockaders while the soldiers were outside the barricade, as this meant a heavy fire could be kept up. But once the stockade was breached, the odds swung heavily against the defenders. Even the pikemen, whose weapons, although quite crude, were extremely dangerous and had further reach than the soldiers' bayonets, were outclassed by the professional military men. Only one man, Private Joseph Wall, is known to have been killed by a pike, He lived less than an hour after being spiked, and while he saw the stockade taken, he was dead before his fellows got him back to government camp. But the real question here is why so many Americans wanted in. They were not only prepared to fight for the stockaders, the majority of them died for the cause too. If modern research regarding the ethnic makeup of the stockaders who were there on the morning of the attack is correct, they made up the majority of those who remained that night, even ahead of the much vaunted Irishman under Peter Lawler. But why? Looking at American research into the Eureka stockade and contemporary documents written by the Americans who were there can give us a clue. The point at which most Americans became deeply interested in the Digger Army was around the time of the split between the Ballarat Reform League and Peter Lawler's physical force men. The BRL was a non-violent group who believed in changing laws through democratic agitation. Peter Lawler and his followers, on the other hand, Lawlerites, maybe that's going a bit far, felt that the time had passed for such action and believed violence was now the only answer. From there, it was a short step towards demanding separation from Britain and independence from the Crown. They took this step, no matter how unlikely they were to succeed, and it is here that many of the Americans decided they wanted in. To them, this was another revolution. It was something they understood and which, if successful, they may have felt they stood to benefit from. By the time McGill rode up to the stockade on the afternoon of the 2nd of December, when the movement had almost gone completely off the rails, it had become the kind of fight that a large number of Americans on the diggings understood. Lawler's determination to fight for independence beyond all else might have turned those away who were more interested in things like abolishing the licence fee, gaining the right to vote, and being able to buy land and settle in the colony, but it was a siren call to the Americans. This was something they could get behind, and they'd be damned if they missed it. A real-life revolution. Of course, the stockade was not a revolution at all, but it turned out that the Americans didn't need to worry, with the exception of African-American man John Joseph, about the consequences of their participation. Despite having been enemies not so long ago, during the War of 1812, the British were coming to realise that, in the face of a growing threat from Russia, that the United States was a natural ally. They shared a common language, and Britain was America's largest trading partner, among other likenesses. Charles Hotham, the Governor of Victoria, had strict instructions that nothing was to be done to upset the delicate diplomatic dance Britain was engaging in with America. And interestingly, American ambassadors in British colonies had similar instructions from their own government in Washington. Now, had Hotham arrested upwards of 100 American citizens after Eureka, he would not have so much upset that burgeoning relationship as torpedoed it. So Hotham cut a deal with the American ambassador. All the white Americans could skip off into the sunset without charges, no matter what they were accused of doing at the stockade. This caused a lot of bad feeling among other stockaders, those who faced charges and those who didn't, but the British government saw it as a necessary sacrifice. Their long-term geopolitical aims were more important than the law in this case. So now we know who some of the major American players were and why they chose to get involved in what was a British political issue. I'm going to take another break. And when I get back, we're going to take a stroll down counterfactual lane and consider what would have happened if McGill's Americans had met Sir Robert Nicol's soldiers on the road to Ballarat in 1854. Sit tight. It's about to get interesting. And we're back, skeptics, but before we jump into our counterfactual, I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. Many historians will argue that counterfactuals and what-if scenarios should be avoided in serious history, but I think they have their place if they're grounded in reality. Once you start what-ifing without boundaries, then it all becomes fantasy, but if it stays within what was happening at the time, then I think it does have historical value. For instance, A common assumption in the primary source Eureka material is that it was a given fact that McGill and his 200 Americans would have been able to waylay Major General Sir Robert Nicholl and his soldiers, and possibly even steal their heavy guns. This has trickled over into some modern Eureka scholarship too, and has informed some of the prejudice against McGill and the other Americans who were perceived to have abandoned the stockaders in their hour of need. But let's look at the facts before we play at speculation. First, as I've said time and time again, McGill and his heavily armed Americans left the stockade at Peter Lawler's request and with his permission. Whatever Lawler claimed later, we know that for a fact. Second, there were wild claims in the aftermath of the stockade that the Americans left on the orders of their ambassador, James Tarleton. And this has even been portrayed as fact in documentaries and docudramas that have been produced in recent years. We know this too is false. Tarleton certainly didn't approve of American involvement in the stockade and wanted his countrymen to stay out of it, but he had no power to force them to leave. Claims that the Americans were paid to leave the stockade, or that the ambassador was given advance notice of the attack by British troops, which he then passed on to his countrymen, are unsupported nonsense. The only people who knew in advance of the attack on the stockade were Captain Thomas, Captain Paisley, and Commissioner Reed, because they were the ones planning it. Thomas and Paisley were professional soldiers who would not have done something so stupid as to disclose their plans to a civilian diplomat from a foreign country. And there's no evidence Tarleton was even in Ballarat on the night of the attack. He had been there earlier in the week, but he was back in Melbourne when the news began to spread on the morning of the 3rd of December. So, presumably, he had left Ballarat at least 2 days prior. If he caught a coach to Geelong and then took the steamer to Melbourne, it would have taken him 2 days to get back, and 3 if he took a coach the whole way. This claim can be further disproved by the fact that Thomas did not decide to launch the attack until around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of the 3rd of December. Tarleton could not have heard about this, rushed off to the stockade to warn the stockaders, safely evacuated the Americans, and then got back to Melbourne in a matter of hours. And we know he was at the American embassy when he received news of the attack. Reed could not have told Tarleton, not only because he wasn't there, but because Reed himself remained behind in government camp after Thomas made the decision to attack. There's one final act regarding the ambush on Melbourne Road that it's important to know before we dive into my counterfactual. As discussed in previous episodes, both the military and police had spies in the stockade, and Captain Thomas had been informed that the stockaders were sending out large ambush parties to waylay the Major General and the reinforcements. Thomas sent a message which Nicholl received around the 2nd of December, warning him not to come up Melbourne Road and to take an alternative route to Ballarat. McGill's ambush was doomed to fail because the soldiers were not coming that way. It's also interesting to consider the time of the ambush itself. The ambush parties were only going out at night, as it was assumed that the reinforcements would march around the clock to get to Ballarat as quickly as they could. Nicholl, who was a very experienced officer who had fought in Ireland, India and Afghanistan in his career, would have known that marching along narrow, poorly maintained roads in the dark at night in unfamiliar terrain would have been very stupid. Also, soldiers were not machines in 1854. They're not now, for that matter, either. And the men needed to sleep. It took the reinforcement party 5 days to get to the diggings, and once they were there, they did not collapse with fatigue, unlike some of their fellows already in Ballarat. Therefore, they must have slept, so probably didn't travel by night. And the soldiers would have alternated between travelling by cart and walking, while Nicholl and the other officers would have ridden the whole way. The stockaders stationed lookouts on Melbourne Road during the day, but the 2 ambush parties only went out at night. The stockaders probably thought they had a better chance of arranging to defend themselves in the day if the soldiers were spotted than they did at night, although had the army spotted any lookout while they were approaching during daylight, they would have killed or captured him if they could. I mention again also that the soldiers were not coming up Melbourne Road, so the lookouts wouldn't have seen anything anyway. Now that we know the facts, I'm going to take another break. And when I get back, we're going to look at what would have happened to McGill and his brave Americans had they attacked the British military on the road. I'll see you in a minute. And welcome back, skeptics. And now, let's play pretend and consider if the stockaders' belief that McGill and his 200 Americans could have seriously disrupted the reinforcements coming up from Melbourne and possibly even stolen their artillery was justified. What would have happened if Thomas's message about the ambush hadn't got through to the Major General and, due to either desperation or hubris, he had ordered his men to march through the night and they'd either arrived 2 days earlier or Thomas had decided to wait for Nickel to arrive before he attacked? Undoubtedly, the party would have gone up Melbourne Road, as that was the most obvious route for a large body of men with a long baggage train and heavy guns. So, in these circumstances, they would have walked right into McGill's ambush. As we know, there were 200 Americans involved in setting this trap, most of them positioned above the road and armed with rifles, which could match or in some cases exceed the range of the muskets being carried by the soldiers. It's also very likely that not all the soldiers would have been armed at this point, and many of their guns would have been unloaded and were being carried in carts. Those men who were marching would have had their guns, although whether they were loaded or rather they just had their bayonets fixed will never be known. Soldiers could load very quickly, however, even in the era of muzzle-loading black powder weapons, and experienced men could get off up to 4 shots a minute, or even 5. They didn't care if they hit anything. Most experienced soldiers would also carry their bullets in the waistbands of their trousers rather than in the cartridge boxes on their hips, which made ammunition easier to access in a fight. The men of the 12th, for example, when they arrived in Ballarat, were still in their carts, and only a few of them were able to retrieve their guns when the stockaders set on them, whereas a contingent of the 40th Regiment, which had arrived just a few hours earlier on the 28th of November, had marched in with weapons loaded and bayonets fixed. Aside from being hissed at and jeered by the diggers, this group was left alone. Unarmed soldiers, squashed together in carts, made easy targets, it would seem, but armed men expecting trouble were best avoided. The reinforcements would have fallen into both categories. There would have been forward and rear scouts and armed men marching alongside the column, but there would have also been plenty of men in carts, and most of them would have been unarmed, with their weapons being carried in the baggage train. There would have also been men, though, whose job it was to guard the artillery, and they would have undoubtedly been armed. It's also worth considering the numbers involved. There were 200 Americans lying in wait, and 800 men, roughly 720 soldiers and a contingent of 80 sailors, including Major General Sir Robert Nickel and his officers, heading for Ballarat. Those Americans would have been outnumbered 4-1. However, McGill and his men would have had some advantages if they planned their ambush carefully, and for the purposes of our counterfactual investigation, we're going to assume that they did do so. First of all, it would have been dark, and few of the soldiers, apart from a very small number of the 40th Regiment, would have been to Ballarat before, so they were on unfamiliar ground and would have been moving slowly because of it. Also, the roads leading to Ballarat were shocking in 1854 because there were no workers to repair them. The soldiers and sailors would have been tripping and stumbling, and the artillery guns probably got stuck in ruts and had to be pushed out more than once along the road. It's also unclear if McGill knew just how many soldiers there were, but a small party can successfully ambush a much larger one, and McGill's best chance of success would have been to attack the middle of the column and either try to cut the formation in two or to separate the regular men from their officers. If the Americans had been able to do this, they would have stood a good chance of inflicting some damage, perhaps even successfully stealing some of the carts. They really wanted the carts with arms and ammunition on them before the tables were turned. Because ultimately, whatever might have happened in this alternate universe, I think it would be inevitable. The tables would have been turned. McGill and the Americans simply didn't have the numbers, and it's also questionable whether they had the skills to engage with a large contingent of professional military men indefinitely. If they took the course which may have allowed them some initial success, attacking the column in the middle, they would have caused confusion, especially if men were separated from their officers. However, situations like these are the very reason that militaries have hierarchies. So someone is always in charge, and so everyone else knows who that someone is. In this instance, separated and confused, the soldiers and sailors would have been vulnerable. But there would have been NCOs within each group, and unlike many of the commissioned officers, these were experienced soldiers held in high regard by the regular men. Once they had realised what was happening, they would have taken charge of the situation. It was what they were trained to do after all. And unless the Americans had engaged in a hit-and-run type attack, it probably would have all been over for them from there. One of the reasons I doubt that McGill was planning a hit-and-run style raid was because he and Lawler both really, really wanted those heavy guns. He may have hoped in the confusion that he and his men would be able to steal at least one of them, but if they did, then they were seriously underestimating the ability of the British military to protect those guns. In fact, underestimation of the British military appears to have been a theme at Eureka, and it was informed more by ignorance and prejudice than reality. Soldiers and sailors at this time were not usually educated men, this is true, but they weren't stupid either, and they were professionals. McGill, who had undoubtedly been brought up on the myths of the American Revolution, which portrayed the average British soldier either as a bumbling idiot or a bloodthirsty monster, probably had no real sense of exactly what he was up against. The 720-odd infantry on Melbourne Road, along with their 80 sailor colleagues, would have forcibly resisted any attempt by McGill's men to take their artillery, and the main priority during any attack would have been to protect it. 200 men absolutely could not have prevailed against 800, especially not once a semblance of order had been restored to the fight and the professional army had started to do what professional armies do. Despite hysterical stories sweeping Melbourne, there was actually nowhere on the road to Ballarat which could be made impassable or held indefinitely by a small number of men. And so the results of this fight in our counterfactual game would have been a bloodbath. Even if McGill and his men managed to cut the column off in the middle and cause some damage, it wouldn't have taken long for the soldiers to regroup, even if they initially had to fall back and then go on the offensive. Also, the men who were ahead when it had been cut off wouldn't have simply continued marching on to Ballarat. They would have quickly turned around and gone back to help, which would have meant the Americans would have found themselves fighting a bloody little war on two fronts against professional military men who massively outnumbered them. Undoubtedly, the reinforcements would have taken some men dead or wounded. As we know, the Americans caused much of the trouble for the British Army at the stockade itself, but ultimately the Americans couldn't have triumphed. And it's even hard to know if there would have been survivors who could have got back to Ballarat, but I lean towards the likelihood of an almost complete rout of the Americans by the British. And here's why. We know that at the stockade, many of the stockaders, quite understandably, abandoned the barricade once it was breached by the military. Now, whatever someone like Peter Lawler said, this was not cowardice, it was self-preservation. Whatever those stockaders might have believed of themselves in daylight, they were not soldiers, and they were not trained to hold their ground in the face of a major assault. But one group who did stay until the bitter end were the Americans. They accounted for the majority of the dead at Eureka and caused the most damage to the British Army at the stockade as well. There's no reason to believe they would have retreated in any number on the road, or even that they would have been able to do so. They would have been quite quickly surrounded by those 800 men. It would have been a nasty, bloody, high-casualty event, And the British soldiers and sailors would probably have been in no mood to take prisoners once they had regrouped and pushed back against the Americans. In the dark and the confusion, it would also be difficult for any American who wanted to surrender to do so. Soldiers with their blood up in any conflict, be it in 1854 or down to the modern day, do not always realise an adversary is trying to surrender until it's too late. It's also worth noting that while the fight would have gone against the Americans in the end, they would have successfully caused some damage and no doubt seriously killed or wounded several soldiers and sailors. Their friends and comrades would have taken this personally, and the British military at this time officially tolerated and in fact even encouraged revenge, which was considered an honourable and manly action. This idea was not unique to the military, but they were one group who usually had the immediate means to enact it. In the aftermath of this fight, any wounded Americans unable to run, walk or crawl away would probably have been bayoneted by the victorious soldiers, which sounds horrifically cruel to us, but was commonplace across all militaries or military-like groups at the time, and left at the side of the road. It's harder to know what the military would have done with their own dead. They wouldn't have wanted to simply leave them in the open, but nor could they carry bodies with them to Ballarat. I suspect they may have taken a few hours to dig a mass grave and buried them there before moving on. But before we close out today, I have one more counterfactual I'd like to consider. What would have happened if, to quote Gregory Blake, by some fluke of fortune or rank incompetence by the soldiers, McGill's men had managed to capture at least one of those artillery pieces? Chances are, nothing. Or nothing for the stockaders anyway. British infantry, who made up the bulk of the reinforcement column, were trained in situations where it appeared a fight was going against them and they may have to retreat and abandon heavy guns to disable them. This was smart because it prevented an enemy using the army's own guns against them. But disabling an artillery piece in the 19th century was no mean feat, and soldiers tended not to want to cause too much damage to their guns because there was every possibility they'd be able to recapture them once they regrouped. If it had looked like McGill's men were going to get even a single one of those heavy guns, the soldiers responsible for protecting it would have done everything in their power to make sure it was unworkable or, at the very least, difficult to use. I think it's also worth pointing out it's one thing to capture an artillery piece. There's no evidence any of the stockaders actually knew how to use them. One of the most common methods that soldiers used at this time to create a problem for an enemy who was imminently about to capture their heavy guns was to kill the horses or oxen pulling the equipment. This did nothing to the gun itself, but it made it difficult to maneuver, as anyone who later captured it would have to man-haul it into position. Now, some of the artillery pieces in use in the 19th century could weigh in excess of 2,000 kilos and would have taken a large team of men hours just to haul a few kilometres. The average pulling power of a fit human man is around 90 kilos. So they would have needed roughly 22 men simply to move a 200-kilo artillery piece, let alone drag it 6.5 kilometres to Ballarat from Warrenheip. I also suspect that McGill would have had trouble getting his men to haul any guns they might have captured in the first place. The stockaders believed they were fighting for independence and were very proud of the fact that they were free men. I can't imagine any of these free men would have been willing to be hooked up to an artillery piece like a horse, nor would they have dragged it anywhere. British soldiers did, very occasionally, man-haul their artillery in circumstances where it was required, and an officer in the 19th century wrote that there was no greater display of British grit and spirit than a company of infantrymen hauling artillery without a word of complaint. I suspect that the reason the officer didn't hear any complaints is because the men were too smart to moan where he could hear them, although I bet some colourful language was shared when he was out of earshot. And soldiers who found themselves in that position probably bit their tongues and dragged because they knew perfectly well they'd be savagely flogged if they told their officers to pull their own damn guns. McGill had no such ability or inclination to discipline his men, and no way to entice them to drag artillery to Ballarat either. In this circumstance, they probably would have been forced to leave the gun for the British Army to retrieve later, and there would have been some very angry soldiers by the time they arrived in Ballarat if they'd had to man-haul an artillery piece 6.5 kilometres. Other methods British soldiers of this period used to disable guns were to pour water on the gunpowder, to roll shells or other ammunition away down ravines or into nearby rivers or streams, break the wheels of a gun carriage, or, in extreme cases, set fire to the gunpowder. This was a method of last resort, as the resulting explosion would kill the soldier who set it off, as well as anyone who had the misfortune to be standing nearby as well. Such an explosion was also likely to cause thousands of pounds worth of damage to other equipment, not to mention injuries to dozens or hundreds of men, and would have been very difficult for any surviving officers to explain to an angry parliament back in England who had to foot the bill. In our counterfactual, it is unlikely any of these things would have been done by the soldiers if they'd had to abandon their artillery during an attack on the road, unless all of McGill's men were mounted, which would have meant they would have had horses to haul the artillery. Some of them may have been, McGill himself certainly was, but there's no evidence either way about the amount of horses the Americans had. But let's situate ourselves firmly back into reality as we come to the end of today's podcast. The forces of James McGill and Robert Nichol never met each other on the road, and never would have done, because Nichol had been forewarned of the ambush and took a different route. McGill and his Americans quickly disbanded after the stockade was routed by the army on the 3rd of December, and geopolitical considerations meant they were treated with a higher degree of tolerance than their British, Irish, or continental European fellows. This caused anger and frustration among their stockader comrades, which later saw the Americans written out of the stockade story or cast as cowards, shirkers, and deserters. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a group, the Americans contributed more to Eureka than any other nationality, with the Irish coming a close second. And they were certainly the best armed and among the best organised when the attack did occur. They deserve far more recognition than they've received from history, whatever their many faults. And I'm pleased to see the tide is shifting in this regard. Works are being published examining the American contribution, and the old histories which ignored the Americans are being reviewed and in some cases rewritten. And in my opinion, this can only be a good thing for the history of Eureka. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Skeptical Historian Writes a Thesis. New episodes are released every second Tuesday and available wherever you get your favourite shows. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out on social media. I am Juliana Byers on both LinkedIn and Instagram, or find me online and check out my work at www.skepticalhistory.com. That's skeptical with a K. And join me next episode for another skeptical take on the mystery that is history. The Skeptical Historian is researched, produced and hosted by me, Juliana Byers. You can find a full list of resources used in my research by going to my rss.com podcast page, clicking on the relevant episode, opening the transcript and scrolling down to find the sources. That's rss.com/podcast/the-skeptical-historian. Sound effects are by Adobe Creative Cloud, Pixabay and Epidemic Sound. The music track The Whistle Funk is by Telsonic. Podcast hosting is by rss.com. See you next time, skeptics.